IPC Sunday School, Class 6, Chapter 10, Gideon. Dear students, please make sure that you read the Bible portion mentioned on the slide in order to get a context of what the lesson is all about. We will learn about a young man named Gideon who was chosen by God to deliver his people, the Israelites. As we all know that after the death of Moses, it was Joshua who led the Israelites toward the promised land Canaan. When they reached there, they realized that they had to get rid of the inhabitants of that land in order to occupy their promised land. Once they took possession of the land, the Israelites forgot their Lord God and turned to serve the gods of these nations. And this very much displeased the Lord. And God handed them over to their enemies. When Israelites repented in the midst of this persecution, God chose some people in order to rescue or deliver them from this situation. And these people were known as judges. There were 15 judges who ruled over Israel, and Gideon was the fifth judge. So now let's learn some facts about Gideon. Gideon belonged to the tribe of Manasseh. His father's name was Joash, and he belonged from the family of Abiezer. By profession, Gideon was a farmer, and he was a judge chosen by God to fight against the Midianites. After the rule of the fourth judge, Deborah, the Israel turned again and started serving the gods of the Amorites, as a result of which God delivered them into the hand of Midian. Midianites persecuted the Israelites by destroying their crops and their livestock. Israelites suffered a lot and they cried out to the Lord. Now, this is when God chooses Gideon to save the Israelites from the hand of the Midianites. One day, as Gideon was hiding the wheat under an oak tree from the Midianites, an angel of the Lord appears to him and says, "Jehovah is with you, O mighty man of valor." But Gideon responds by questioning God. If the Lord is really with us, then why are we suffering so much? And why are we being oppressed by the Midianites? The angel then proceeds to tell Gideon that he will deliver the Israelites from the Midianites. Upon hearing this, Gideon starts making excuses by saying that he is from the weakest clan of his tribe and that he is the least in his father's house. But the Lord reassures him, and he says that he will be with Gideon, and Gideon shall destroy the Midianites as one man. But Gideon was in disbelief, and he asked the angel of God to wait, and departed, and returns with an offering of food and sets it out on the rock. Then the angel of the Lord put out the end of the staff that was in his hand, and touched the food, and fire rose out of the rock and consumed it. That's when Gideon perceived that it was truly God who spoke with him. So Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and called it Jehovah Shalom, the Lord is peace. That same night, God commands Gideon to destroy one of his father's altars of Baal and replace it with an altar to the Lord God and sacrifice a bull on it. Gideon gathers 10 of his servants and does as the Lord commanded. Following this, the men of the city came to know that it was Gideon who had destroyed the altar and confronted Joash, his father, and demanded that Gideon be killed for this act. However, Joash responded to them saying, "If Baal is truly a god, then let him defend himself." And therefore, on that day, Gideon was called Jerubbaal, which means let Baal plead. Before going to the war, Gideon wanted to ensure that God is really with him and that he would save Israel from the hands of Gideon. And therefore he asked for another sign. Gideon places a fabric of wool on the threshing ground and asks God. First thing he asked God was to make the fleece or the fabric the only wet thing and the rest of the field should be dry. He then asked God to do the reverse. This time that the field should be wet and the fabric should be dry. And God did both. And hence Gideon was reassured that God is with him in this battle. So Gideon then gathers an army of 32,000 warriors to fight against the Midianites. But the Lord then tells Gideon that he must cut down the size of his army because otherwise the Israelites won't contribute their win to God but rather to themselves. As the Lord commanded, Gideon asked the warriors who were afraid to leave the camp, and out of the 32,000, 22,000 warriors left. However, God said that it is still too many people, and so he instructs Gideon to take the remaining 10,000 people down to the river and to see how these people drink. God then instructed to keep the ones who lapped and drank with their hands and asked them to stay. And therefore, only 300 men remained for the war. That night, God instructs Gideon to go down to the camp of the Midianites with his servant Purah. In the valley, Gideon overhears a conversation between two Midianites in which one Midianite says he had a dream where a loaf of bread came tumbling down to the camp of Midian and it struck and the tent collapsed. The other Midianite interprets this as the sword of Gideon laying wrath upon the Midianites. After hearing this, Gideon decides to go back and starts preparing for the war. Gideon devises a plan to defeat the Midianites and tells his people to split up into 3 groups. He then gives everyone trumpets and jars with torches in them and asked his army to imitate him. After marching to the Midianite camp, Gideon takes the lead and blew the trumpet and broke the jar that was in his hands. And similarly, his army imitated him, and they together cried out, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." Upon hearing the sound of the trumpets and the breaking of jars, the Midianites got frightened and confused and fought amongst themselves and fled from the camp. And that is how Gideon captured the land from their enemies. And later on, he killed Oreb and Zeb, the Midianite princes, and also Zebah and Zalmunna, the Midianite kings. So let's learn a few characteristics of Gideon. First one being, then Gideon was a very humble man. Now this we understand. After the war with the Midianites, the men of Israel gathered to Gideon and said, "Rule over us, both you and your son, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian." But Gideon replied to them, saying that he won't rule over them, but the Lord shall rule over them. So Gideon always attributed his win to the Lord first, and that's how he was a humble man. The second characteristic that we learn about Gideon is that he believed and obeyed God completely. How do we understand that? When God asked Gideon to cut down his army from 32,000 men to 300, Gideon knew that 300 was a very small army to fight the Midianites. But still, he chose to believe and obey God and trusted God's decision. The third thing we learned from Gideon was that he was a vigilant man who cared for and protected his own property at all times. Now, this we understand when the angel of God appears to him and to call him for his ministry. Gideon was protecting his wheat under an oak tree from the Midianites. And the people of Israel enjoyed rest and peace for 40 years during the days of Gideon. So let's learn some lessons that we can apply in our daily lives. We often doubt our capabilities for fulfilling the deeds of the Lord, but we can learn something very prominent from the life of Gideon and many others from the Bible. God doesn't need our abilities to fulfill his task. All he needs for us is to be available for him and to trust him. If we take examples from the Bible, like Moses, he was a stutterer. Gideon made excuses saying that he was from the weakest clan. But what we understand that he or they never said no to what God asked them to do. They were always available. And hence we should be like them. We should never say no to what God has asked us or what God has called us to do. And that is how, because God is able to use ordinary people to do extraordinary work. And we understand that they were able to do everything that God asked them to do. Because with God, all things are possible. So God doesn't need our abilities. He needs our availability and trust. A second thing we'll need to learn is that we need to give all glory and honor to the Lord. When we achieve something in life, we often tend to praise ourselves or thank our parents or our mentors who helped us in order to achieve that something. But instead, we need to give all glory and honor to God who gave us those talents and enabled us to achieve that something. It may be scoring good marks in academics or gaining prizes in our talent test or any school program. What we need to understand is that all glory and honor should be given to the Lord first. The next thing we can learn from Gideon's life is that God will always be there to help us increase our faith in Him if we seek for it wholeheartedly. Gideon constantly asked for signs from the Lord for him to be sure that God is with him and that God's presence will lead him. But God never turned him down. Instead, He gave him all the signs he needed for him to be sure. Likewise, when God asks us to do something, God asks us to do something for Him, we can always approach Him for reconfirmation that He is with us in our lives to fulfill His will. I hope you all have understood the story of Gideon and the spiritual lessons which we learn out of it. Let's all strive to be like Gideon and put our trust in the Lord and obey Him at all times. God bless you.